to this process with us, as Devin just did, record these sessions and have them be available as part of our work around transparency, and to make sure that they're accessible to everyone who couldn't join us today, or who would want to go back and review some of the conversation that we have in these council meetings. We have, as you can assume from the introduction here, invited a distinguished group of individuals to be on the Equity Advisory Council. We're not going to take the time to have them introduce themselves all here. Devin is going to put into the chat a link to all of their names and bios for anyone who would like to go and see who's on the council for us. The work of the council is oriented around helping Credential Engine understand and improve the data elements and the transparency obligations that we can meet, of ensuring that we can describe and support the navigation of not just pathways and transfer and recognition of prior learning processes, but that we can help people understand if those pathways and transfer opportunities are in fact equitable, if they will in fact help somebody avoid dead ends and poor outcomes, and in fact can help them achieve the equitable outcomes that they all are looking for. So the council here is going to be helping us work through that process to think about what equity means in terms of pathways and transfer, and to help Credential Engine ensure that we have rich data capabilities, not just in making data transparent, but in having those data be usable and used by individuals to traverse equitable pathways. In order to do that, we obviously need to have a working definition of equity. And Kristen has been working with the council over the last several months in developing such a definition, and is going to walk you through now where we stand with that.
Thanks, Scott. I also wanted to thank the council for their really intentional time and discussion that we've had in prior council meetings to really ensure that our definition of equity was intentional, but also broad enough to capture the many areas that we know are important. So as you read this definition, we're hoping that there are a few things that will kind of stand out to you. We really do know that equity is about the systemic barriers and the acknowledgement of it. We know that that is particularly important for certain populations, specifically racial equity and racial minoritization that's taken place. We know that that is not inclusive of all things, and we list here a few key categories that we want to elevate. One of the categories that we just recently discussed about that is not as intentionally articulated that we intend to include is around ableism, to ensure that we're talking about meeting people across all of the spectrum. Additionally, another thing that you'll see is that it was really important for the council not just to define equity, but also talk about how we reach equity. So with that in mind, we also have what we call the equity statement, which I'll now switch to. I will also put these in the chat so that you all will have time to marinate and become more acquainted with them. But the statement itself really talks about how defining is not enough, but these are the things that we need to do in order to reach equity across the board. So one of the things that you'll see that we're really looking to intentionally outline again, we talk about dismantling the structures. We talk about how it's important that we not only acknowledge people's different backgrounds, beliefs, and abilities, but we create a place for belonging so that they can feel as if they are an asset and adding to the room. But it's also about the outcomes. How do we ensure that this is not just about identifying, but the strategies we put in place also allow for there to be a change, and that it actually allows for there to be progress to be made. And that really ties well to why this work around the data is so important. It will allow an intentional place for both data users and the back end of the house to be saying, this is what we mean. We're able to draw clear measures and metrics about if those outcomes are being successful and if they're not. And that allows us the opportunity to, again, recircle back around and identify what do we need to be doing to close these equity gaps. So I'm going to circle back to the definition just to give you all some more time to kind of read it, but we'll shortly place them in the chat. So don't want you to feel as if they're going away. We also want to acknowledge that, again, these might seem broad to those that are first viewing them. We want to acknowledge that state, system, and other organizations really should use their local data to better understand who their equity populations are and what their gaps are. What we believe we have outlined is a clear identification of what equity should reflect, that those populations are included here, even if not explicitly stated, but we wanted to provide a roadmap for other organizations to be thinking about how they define equity and then how they reach equity. So I'm going to pause there, Scott, in case there's anything that you want to add before placing these, both of these items into the chat.
No, thank you. I don't think I have anything to add to that. Let me see if any of the council members want to elaborate or add to anything that Kristen just walked us through for the definition and the statement. And we invite anyone who has joined us from the public, if there are comments or questions or insights or anything you want to add, please use the chat. Please consider if you want to say something about what we've just presented, or at any point during this conversation, just raise your hand in the tool here, and we can call on you to share that verbally if you'd like to, or you can just use the chat, however you prefer. All right, thank you. Kristen has put those in the chat if people wanted to refer back to those. We will also, following this meeting, share back with everyone who's on today and anyone who had signed up to be on today but couldn't make it, the video of the meeting when it's out, as well as the documents that, the definition, the slides that Jeannie's about to go through, and anything else will be publicly available for you. Okay, not seeing any hands and not seeing any comments in the chat. Kristen, thank you very much for that. And thank you again for all the work you and Laura have done in working the process through to come up with a very rich and actionable definition. So the council in the end is focused on helping Credential Engine put forward two sets of recommendations. The first set of recommendations will be around, once we've determined what additional data we need to be able to publish and making transparent in order to determine equity related to pathways and transfer, the council will be putting together a recommendation for providers of credentials and calling on them to make sure that when they're publishing their information in the credential registry using our schema, that they're not just adding the minimum they can, that they're adding the richest information possible about those data fields in order to support the ability for users to understand the equitable aspects, or inequitable aspects, quite honestly, of the credentials that are offered and how they fit into pathways that may or may not actually contribute to equitable outcomes. So the first set of recommendations will be targeting those providers of credentials and what they should be making public about what they offer. The second set of recommendations is going to be focused on the use side and ensuring that organizations who use data as part of counseling, navigation, guidance, pathway, career search, any of the kind of tools that are intended to serve people in their making decisions about what to choose and where to go, that those organizations are then using these data in ways that actually actively and intentionally help people be able to make better decisions about the pathways they're choosing and they're heading down, the transfer avenues and options available to them that will help them understand, is that choice going to lead me into an equitable pathway to the outcomes I'm looking for? or not. And so again, it's not just having the data be available, it's helping those organizations actively and intentionally use those data in ways that will help people make the best decisions they can. So 2 sets of recommendations, one on the publishing side, one on the use side, and we'll be seeking publishing partners as well as those companies that build the user tools to work with us and to commit to the recommendations that we're putting forward, and to actually help test some of those with us to make sure that we're actually putting something out that can be done and will be valuable in the marketplace. So let me just see if there's any thoughts or comments about that, and then we're going to move into the presentation from Jeanne about the work that we've been doing to date around pathways and transfer. Okay.
So Scott, this is Tina Gridiron with ACT Center for Equity and Learning, and I just wanted to underscore the forward thinking of Credential Engine in addressing both the publishing side and the use side together in this work, that we often see great policy put forward, but then not a lot of intentionality and action around how that policy is implemented in different spaces and in different contexts and for different populations. So the forward thinking aspect of this work in connecting both the design pieces, the publishing side of the house, and the use pieces with the players and the counselors and the organizations that are touching individuals every day, that combination is a powerful combination and something I'm excited about in this work.
Yes, thank you. We always say that it's not enough to build just the biggest, most beautiful library, but unless people are using it and able to actually improve themselves and make better decisions because of the availability of the information in the library, what's the good of a beautiful library? Okay, well, let's jump into the presentation to be able to ground people in where Credential Engine is now and how we think about pathways and transfer. And to do that, Jeanne Kitchens is the Chief Technology Services Officer here and is the really guiding light behind the development of the Credential Engine credential transparency description language and all of our work around the schemas and transparency to date. So Jeannie's going to walk us through a set of slides right now. Thank you, Jeanne.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the introduction, but I really have to credit a very large team that we work with that makes this all possible. I'm going to provide an introduction to some of the CTDL terms used for pathways and transfer value in the context of equitable pathways and transfer value. So I'll provide a short introduction to the CTDL for those who have joined today who may not be familiar. And then I'm going to kind of walk through telling the story of the CTDL and how it relates to equitable pathways, and telling the story of how it relates to transfer value. Credential Engine offers a stack of open technologies. These technologies are in the US national infrastructure, and all of it is grounded and built upon the Credential Transparency Description language. This is a very large language for describing all kinds of information about credentials and adjacent types of information that I'll talk a little bit more about in the next couple of slides. We also develop, maintain, and make available for anyone to use in a suite of publishing tools for publishing, for taking information and transforming that into CTDL linked open data. The publishing tools include, an API, of course, for publishing structured data, and then other tools, for example, using a bulk upload, which has an API behind it as well. And we have the Credential Registry that Scott was just talking about, which is more than just a database. It is a long-term repository of CTDL linked open data that is made available for the purpose of others to use that data to power applications. The CTDL and the Credential Registry fit into a very large ecosystem. So this slide could have lots and lots of circles on it, but just to simplify the ecosystem, we can see where credentialing organizations can issue credentials to learners, and they could put information about those credentials in the Credential Registry. Quality assurance entities that may accredit, approve, endorse, recognize credentials, they can put data into the Credential Registry. Employers who may also issue credentials and have competencies can put data into the registry. And within this ecosystem, each of these examples of stakeholders in the ecosystem can utilize that data in the registry. It's important to know that the Credential Registry contains no personally identifiable information. Rather, it provides information that's useful to credential earners and learners who want to use, like digital credentials, and to credentialing organizations or employers that issue those credentials. The data in the registry can be utilized to provide rich descriptions of those credentials issued to people. So no personally identifiable information is ever part of the Credential Registry, but the CTDL and the Credential Registry are useful to any kinds of systems or applications that do deal with personally identifiable information. The Credential Transparency Description Language, or CTDL, is an openly licensed set of schemas. It is built and modeled on World Wide Web Consortium specifications, specifically for the semantic web. And it is a very large and living language. So one of our goals with the Equity Council is going to be identify any gaps in the CTDL and determine the CTDL terms that are necessary to fill those gaps. On the right-hand side, what you can see with the circles kind of representing areas of the CTDL, and the arrows notionally meaning we can link all of these areas together, because by design, that's what the CTDL does. It's about linked open data. So whether we want to talk about a credential or a pathway, or we want to be able to link that to occupations or even jobs, tasks, work roles, if we want to talk about cost of things, financial assistance, or talk about transfer value, for example, the Credential Transparency Description Language describes all these things and provides the ability to link data together to provide powerful and useful data. Some additional benefits are that it is a very large dictionary of terms for rich descriptions across learning and working. It is extendable to serve many use cases, including international. It's agnostic to industries and domains. Many times we get asked, well, does it work in healthcare, for example? It works across any kinds of industries. It's really the domains are not relevant to the CTDL. The CTDL supports any domain. It supports transparency, comparability, reusability. And what's really important is when we're developing the CTDL, we use a process that's open to all stakeholders. Any interested persons who want to contribute through their subject matter expertise, they're welcome to contribute and participate with the process. The process provides the end result, the CTDL, under an open Creative Commons license for anyone to use, no strings attached. There are no fees. There are no, qualifications to be a member or anything like that. Anyone can use it and anyone can participate. And then we publish the CTDL as linked open data that is both human and machine readable. And for our purposes today, it links valuable information for education and career pathways and transfer value. You can see many examples of data that use the CTDL in the Credential Finder. The Credential Finder is a tool for seeing all of the data in the registry. And what you see on your screen here is an example of a credential that's been published to the Credential Registry as seen through the Credential Finder. And you could get an idea by looking at the picture here on the right of the rich information that was included with this credential, ranging from outcome data to information about connections between this and other credentials, competencies it teaches, quality assurance type information that's also attributable to this credential. So I thought that would be this one would be a particularly good example to give you a good idea of the type of information that can be in the Credential Registry using the CTDL. And so that's my overview, very high level overview of the intro to the CTDL. If anybody has any questions, Scott, I can address them now, or we can wait to the end of the presentation.
Why don't we move on, and if people have questions, we can throw them in the chat, and
Okay.
we can loop back to them.
Sounds great. So first, I'm going to start off in respect to equitable education and career pathways. What you're seeing here on the screen is that draft definition that was dropped into the chat a little bit earlier. And our goal is to be able to expand Credential Engine's ability to describe whether and how pathways are equitable and improve an individual's ability to navigate them. And why the CTDL is important is because we can support the quality, the descriptive dimensions of the providers, the credentials, competencies, courses, cost, duration, jurisdictions, student profiles, and more. So that's what we'll be looking into with the Equity Council. But first, let's talk about what we mean by pathways. I'm talking specifically about education and career pathways, and a lot of times when at Credential Engine, when we're talking about them, we think about things like posters or pictures of what a pathway might look like. What you're seeing here on the screen are some examples of the kinds of pathways that we have analyzed and published with the Credential Transparency Description Language. So whether we're talking about a pure education pathway, such as a Bakersfield College pathway that's all about courses, or a badge pathway that we see here on the right, that's through a badging platform for digital badges, or number three, what I would call a pathway poster that provides kind of a high-level overview of how a person might progress in a career field. From an entry level to, in this case, executive position, to an entire degree pathway that is currently presented as a PDF document that you read, probably about 10 pages. There's many, many other examples of education and career pathways out there. Each of you is probably thinking of some that you're familiar with. And the main thing to know is that the CTDL, regardless of the industry that the pathway's in, whether or not it's combining learning and working, the CTDL can currently support describing those pathways as human and machine readable data. When we're talking about the pathways, just to dig into it a little bit deeper, as I mentioned, the CTDL is a living language, and we're constantly working on it, evolving it to meet the important use cases out there with real data. We have a task group that actually just completed its last pathways meeting this morning. And what we talked about in that meeting, you're seeing here on the slide, is the pathways are already supported by the CTDL. And what I mean by that are progressions of, think about like station stops or along the way of a route of, say, a metro station. We can take many different paths to ultimately get to a destination. That is already supported. Being able to describe some of the conditions for completing a progression through a pathway is already supported. You know, for example, you may have a pathway that has a requirement of completing courses. So we can already describe that with a CTDL. And what we're working on now are more complex descriptions of pathways where we want to express constraints that are more complicated and may be useful for other systems to be able to apply their algorithms to. So when we're talking about the data, it's really important us to talk about being able to support all these kinds of scenarios, whether publishing a simple pathway or getting more complex with more details and helpful information that helps both publishers and consumers of the data or users of that data truly understand what is involved in progressing through a pathway to reach an ultimate destination along the way. We already provide multiple ways of publishing pathways to the Credential Registry. The API currently supports it. We have a spreadsheet upload, but we're also going to start working on a pathway builder tool that will be a drag and drop interface, making it as easy as possible to create pathways and publish them to the Credential Registry. And that work is going to start next month. And this is just a preview of the pathway builder, what it looks like. What you're seeing here on the screen is a graphical design. We have worked out an entire end-to-end graphical design for what it will look like and the requirements for it. And what you're seeing here is a drag and drop interface where you can grab components of a pathway from the Credential Registry and then link them together in this work area over here. So we're really excited about getting that going next month, and we expect that work to be completed at least as an MVP, ready for review and use this year. So some of the pathway components that we currently support, you can see here on the screen. And when I'm talking about a pathway, of course, it could have many different kinds of components. You may have jobs in a pathway or work experience along with other things like assessment or co-curricular activities, competencies, courses, credentials, and so forth. So all of these are the kinds of pieces of the station stops to get to a destination that can be described in a CTDL pathway currently. So in summary, for the context of education and career pathways for the Credential Engine's technologies, education and career pathways identify one or more starting points. So we can imagine that we don't always start at the same place. People have different places that they begin to progress through a pathway from, and various components that are along the route. So station stops along the route to an ultimate destination goal. The CTDL already supports publishing pathways as a living language. We are currently expanding the complexity of use cases that we can support. And with the council, we will also be looking at other properties we might be able to include to express more valuable information to help ensure success along a pathway. So the basic capabilities of the CTDL link resources together to lay the foundation for supporting equitable education and career pathways. So right now, what it looks like out there in the world is a lot of information that's in different places. It's disconnected and it's often confusing. So certainly there's a lot of information about jobs. There's a lot of information about courses out there, for example. There may be a lot of information about assessments, but they're not linked together to clearly articulate and convey how you can progress through a pathway. So what the CTDL does is take all those components and link them together so we can now reuse information about these components, as this example shows, where here maybe I might start by taking it, oh, that should say course, sorry about that, a course or a co-curricular activity. And I can start at either place. Maybe then there's assessment that earns a credential. There may be supports that help us complete that course and successfully complete that assessment that earns competencies. And after earning that credential, I can move on. I can take a course or maybe have some work experience or some other extracurricular activity that prepares me for another assessment, as an example, where I then have competencies, I have supports to help me progress through, earn another credential, and get to a job. So we can link this type of information together to tell the story, both in human readable and machine readable language that can be used by other applications to provide helpful tools to for people. So here's a real example published to the Registry. The National Retail Federation Foundation Rise Up Pathway is a pathway that combines competencies, courses, assessments, and credentials. And you can see in this particular case, a person is entering the pathway at various levels that begin with an entry level through a management level. And with this particular pathway, a person could start anywhere at any level to reach a management level. You could go directly to a management level, or you might start as an entry level and earn your credentials and get up to your management level. This is that pathway that I just showed you the picture of, actually published to the Credential Registry. You could see it in the Credential Finder, and it gives you a really good idea of how those components of that pathway are actually linked together. You can see here in my screenshot, what I did was I clicked on the little icon here that links this component to the components over here that are competencies. So we can link all of that data together to show that progression. And for those who are interested and want to see what that looks like as data, from any page in the Credential Finder, if you click on the icon that says JSON LD, you can see the raw data in the registry expressed as CTDL linked open data. Okay. So what has happened behind the scenes here when we use the CTDL to publish the pathway? This is the National Retail Pathway that I just talked about. Behind it are actually all of the data about those competencies. So what you're seeing here are a whole bunch of screenshots directly from the Credential Finder, keeping in mind that the Credential Finder is powered by the registry. So literally everything you see in there came from the Credential Registry. So through that pathway, each one of these components can have very rich data about the credentials, the courses, the assessments, and the competencies along that pathway. And so what the registry did and what the CTDL did was it linked together all of these components and all of this rich information. So we could see that kind of high level overview and how it links together. But behind it, we could have the richness of all of this information about those components of the pathway. And that is what makes the CTDL really, really important and really valuable, is that ability through its underlying design to be able to link rich information together for reusability, comparability, and in this case, to depict a pathway. Okay, so that was my overview of education and career pathways supported by the CTDL and Credential Registry. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the transfer value portion, and then we'll get into any questions and answers. So transparent transfer value. CTDL supports what we call a transfer value profile. And what I mean by that is basically assertions or information for describing either recommendations for or at what is actually accepted by, say, a college as transfer value, And typically when we think of transfer value, we think of course credits, but it doesn't have to only be course credits. With a CTDL, there could be transfer value, say, for competencies, for example. So what we can do is take information about the value of, say, a traditional credit that comes from learning experiences that may be a course or other types of learning or formal or informal education, and other types of values that could be transferable from one place to another. And we'll take a look at some examples. So we're seeing here some examples of transfer value. The first one that we see here is from a university where this particular university on their website identifies transfer value that they accept from other schools. For the second one, we're seeing the Kansas Board of Regents military service transfer value, and that is where the Board of Regents has identified military occupations and provided the course credit values for those military occupations in certain Kansas, post-secondary institutions. Also below it in number 3, we see transfer Kansas articulation agreements. This is common across states, where within the state, there are articulation agreements between post-secondary institutions for various courses that will provide transfer value amongst those colleges. So all of this information can be described in the CTDL. And number 4, the interstate passport goes broader. So it's not just within one state saying, these are all the different transfer values that we automatically accept. The WICHE transfer value provides transfer value information across state boundaries. Again, that is another post-secondary education example. And the 5th one that we see here is the American Council on Education National Guide, and they provide the service of reviewing more non-traditional types of transfer values. Say a company that offers a training program for their employees, ACE can come in and look at that training and make a transfer value recommendation for post-secondary institutions to accept that training as credit, prior learning credit. So these are some examples of what we mean by transfer value, and all of you probably could think of other examples as well, but I thought it would be helpful to just take a look at a few of them. So with a CTDL, what we can do is make that transfer value information transparent and reusable. Looking at all those examples, you saw screenshots from their website, so clearly that information is on the web. But when the information is on the web and it's really only in one place and it's not published in a way to be reusable or linkable, it still becomes a challenge to put the pieces together and understand how transfer value, how pathways can work together. So currently we have to go to a lot of different websites, right, to see that type of information. And of course, without knowing what's behind a resource, it's very difficult to communicate, identify, analyze, and accept a transfer value. So what we can do is, regardless of the type of transfer value, we could use the CTDL terms to make that human, machine readable, reusable, and linked data, and make that value, of course, visible to everyone. So let's take a look at a real example that's published to the Credential Registry using the CTDL. ACE is working on publishing more of their transfer values. They have a set of, I think, around 38 or 39 transfer values currently published. And in this particular case, the American Council on Education recommends a transfer value for a course. It's a public speaking course, and their recommendation is going to be for 3 lower division level credits with a credit unit of type of semester hour. And the transfer value recommendation is valid for a period of 3 years. So here I just kind of wrote out the story of what the ACE recommendation is. And over here on the right, what you're seeing are the CTDL terms, and adjacent to it, the data or the information that is human and machine readable data in the registry. So for example, the transfer value profile is a CTDL term, and CTID is as well. CTID is a global unique identifier. That's really important as well for linking this data together. And I won't read all of these, but you can take a look and get an idea of how we can really get down to a granular level of this information. So we can know it's a credit unit type, we can know the value, we can see the level and so forth. And that makes it reusable data that's human and machine readable. And over here on the left with a little picture here, you can get an idea of the recommender, in this case is ACE, and they're providing this transfer value. So ACE said, we looked at this training provider and their credential, and we recommend a transfer value. So they're saying, we recommend that some other institution that you accept this as a transfer value. Because behind it, we have a rigorous process for that transfer value review. And in the end, all of this data has been linked together.
Jeannie, I'm going to see if we can wrap it up in about a minute so we can give the council a chance to.
Yep, I think I've got like 2 left here. So I've got an example here that's published to the registry. This is that Sophia example here, what it looks like in the credential finder, and anyone can check that out. And the finder really emulates the data in the registry and linking it all together. And what it did was it linked the ACE transfer value to that Sophia course. So we can see in the finder how it linked all that information together, keeping in mind that behind it, it's actually linked the data together about that transfer value. So that is the overview of the pathways and the transfer value, and our next steps are through an open process, identify gaps, define additional terms for supporting equitable pathways.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Hopefully for those of you who are not as familiar with both CTDL and Credential Engine's work and capabilities, that provided you some good information. And let me just see if there's any questions for Jeannie, but also begin to just ask you to weigh in with what, when you think about a pathway or transfer and you would want to have certain information about them be accessible in what Jeannie just showed you, what was missing there? What is it that you would really want to know that would help you be able to make a determination of whether what you're looking at is in fact an equitable pathway, or that the transfer recommendation is in fact going to assist someone in reaching an equitable outcome? And it can be repetitive of what you think you saw but aren't quite sure. It can be something that you didn't see. So just want to kind of open that question up to people. And just coming off of mute or the chat, feel free to anyone come in and share ideas. And if it's helpful, I'm going to put in the chat a link to a document that were just some additional terms that Kristen and Laura pulled from some previous work they've done adjacent to this kind of work that might just give you a starting point on what else we might want to be thinking about in terms of pathways and transfer. Jeannie, we can probably stop the screen share.
Yeah, if there aren't any questions.
I see Deborah has put something in the chat. Information about the numbers and kinds of jobs that a credential leads to, including how much they pay. Yep. would help someone assess whether that pathway is actually going to lead to equitable outcomes. Yes, so job information and outcome information, excellent.
So this is Rob. This is a weird question, but one that shows up a lot when we look at from an education standpoint in terms of like the value credentials. There are two types of mobility that can be important for jobs, right? One is mobility inside of your sector, but another thing that can be important is the mobility that a credential provides you kind of between sectors, right? So there's some things that we find that can be highly valuable if you want to move up in your sector, but are not particularly transferable, right? This is sometimes the problem of certain industry credentials versus higher education, right? That, you know, you may have a particular certification that allows you to do something in your industry, but outside that industry, it's not that useful in a way that, like, generally speaking, certain higher education credentials, even though they're expensive and take longer, there may be a value to having a master's degree, regardless of if you are in one field and it's one thing. So the question of how the other component of mobility in terms of how does this credential allow you to get a job in a particular industry, as well as how might it be transferable, how transferable is that credential to another industry. It's a hard thing exactly to measure, but that would be like an important thing for folks to think about, particularly folks who are early in their career, knowing, okay, like how useful this will be if the market changes and I decide I need to go into a different industry or a different direction.
So Rob, I'm almost thinking that, you know, if you have a cybersecurity credential, it's applicable across many different industries, and your flexibility with moving around might be higher.
Right.
Right. Okay. Yep.
Right. Or coding. Like there's certain data credentials we find are highly useful. Right. You know, everybody needs data analytics. So if you have an IT or data credential, that is a thing that lots of industries are looking for.
Excellent. Breadth of applicability. Yep.
So Scott, Wayne had put a comment in the chat that I think really gets to that question that we had talked about around outcomes. It says, what is the rubric for determining how a term/model in CTDL promotes or ensures equity?
Well, I want to be, and I'm going to let Jeanne weigh in on this. I want to be careful that, you know, just because there's a term in CTDL that describes an element or an aspect of a credential does not in any way mean that we can ensure. We're not making any assurance that that is directly correlated with equity, right? That there'll be a lot of things in the registry and described via CTDL that might, in fact, help indicate that something is not equitable. And I think that's as important to know as just, you know, being able to have a term. But there's no assurances about it. But I understand the question. How do we understand that those terms put together can signal or indicate equity? Jeanne, you want to?
And maybe maybe a benchmark is another, you know, way to think about it, as opposed to, say, a rubric, where a benchmark, we're offering more of a structure for a combination of data that together provides a lot more value and meaning and equity. Because it would be very difficult for us to create a rubric that measures the quality of somebody else's program. So what we want to do is put in place the benchmarks for how to better describe those things and link that information together in a way to improve equity. We have examples of benchmarks on our website that we might want to drop in the chat, one of those examples, but that seems very applicable here. I could see coming out of this a kind of, you know, for example, an equity benchmark model.
I could also say this is potentially a parallel that might be useful. Whereas Credential Engine also does not independently make value determinations about a credential. What we do is work with organizations whose job is to make value determinations about a credential, which might mean it's a State Department of Labor in determining the value of a credential for being eligible for public funding. It might mean the National Skills Coalition that has a framework that they put together with a number of states to determine whether a credential can be considered a credential of value. What we do is we publish the National Skills Coalition's framework to the registry and allow people to indicate whether a credential offered in Arizona, for instance, meets that framework. And that is itself a data field that can say, yes, this is recognized by Arizona as meeting the Skills Coalition's quality framework. We could do the same thing here if there are organizations that have independent assessments of whether a pathway or transfer is also considered equitable. We can have that indication also published in the registry as another means of helping to reveal independent determinations of equity, just as an example of another option that could be considered in our work here. I'm trying to go through, are there other, thank you, Scarlett, for posting the benchmark models.
So Wade had circled back with the clarifying question, but before that, John had begun to talk about some outcomes, Scott, specifically around transfer that we might need to be keeping in mind. Talking about practical application, what is the amount of client contact or counseling that is taking place, but then talked a little bit about knowledge learning. So he gave some specific to transfer. So don't know if others also want to build out things to keep in mind around transfer.
Yep. And John, is there anything else you want to add to that, or is the chat capture it sufficiently? Might just be able to hit your space bar to come off mute if that's what you're looking for. Or maybe you're typing. Okay. And Jeannie, do you want to try and answer the Wayne's follow-up there while we're waiting?
Well, equitable behavior, you know, as I mentioned earlier, currently, at least the CTDL doesn't have a lot of terms for talking about, you know, a person in terms of behavior. But one of the areas that I was thinking of when I was putting that presentation together and then looking at the charter and work so far of the council is being able to describe supports and supports that then, you know, have an impact on behaviors, you know, that could lead to success, having supports. And so I think that's an area here with the Equity Council that we can definitely work on with the CTDL, where, you know, it's not, we're not describing a specific person's behavior, but we're describing the supports that are in place that help through successful progressions.
I'm reading your post here, Eric. And again, I'll invite you if you want to come off and just discuss what you put in, or if this is sufficient.
Yeah, I'll elaborate a little bit. I think the main point is that, excuse me, it all starts with data, specifically data availability. As Jeannie mentioned, what we're trying to get at, or what this initiative seems to be trying to get at, is a minimum benchmark. Not necessarily dictate how people use it or how they create those pathways that lead to equitable outcomes, but just having, or I guess promoting what those data points need to be collected that then facilitate equitable decision making by both providers and ultimately workers, learners are trying to go back, right? And I think just the availability of that data, making sure that that is out there, is a crucial first step.
Thank you, Eric.
And John, I see you have your hand up, so give you a chance.
Thank you. Sorry, I lost it all a bit earlier. I just think there's an issue here about what you're doing, which is seems to me a wonderful piece of work. I'm very impressed by it. But you're gathering so much information and so much data, and you're trying to create links between different organizations across all the states in America. So it just seems it will be a real challenge to keep that, as it were, under control or within reasonable bounds. In a sense, it seems to me one of the things that the Credential Engine does, and the sort of thing we've been trying to do in UNESCO with the world reference levels, is to find simple ways to produce categories of information which allow people into the system and allow them to make an initial evaluation or search without going into too much depth. You know, if you're trying to evaluate a qualification, you can get the specification, you can get the booklet and read all of that. How can we help people to look more broadly without having to read every damn specification that's available? And that was why I asked that particular question, because counseling courses, if you're progressing through, I happen to know about counseling, happen to progress through counseling, then there are many courses which are very knowledge-based, which will take you on to other qualifications. But for a whole part of the counseling profession, the first question is, have these people actually done any counseling? And if not, then we're not interested. It's about a particular value, a particular course. Now, I would imagine that in some fields, you might not just have two types of transfer value, but 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. Right. And how do you manage all that? I mean, it seems to me you've got a hell of a job in front of you. Sorry, excuse me. You've got a big job in front of you.
I think you took the words right out of my mouth when I took this job 5 years ago. It is. And the way I think about it is that, you know, the reality is that students and workers and learners are dealing with that overwhelming mass of information anyway, without any ability to have the comparison and the other tools that will help them sort it. And so, as I think Eric said, our first step is to get all the information into a common format, and then to invite a whole lot of experts and specialists to help us ask that exact question. What are the things that might be most relevant to help a student or a learner at this moment in their progression, in their pathway? What do they need to know in order to make the best decision? If you've gotten through all of your training and you're looking for counseling jobs with no hours under your belt, maybe the first question is, do you have the hours and I need to go get them? But long before that, it might be, if you go down this pathway, do you recognize that you're going to need hours to get the job? And so there's different points, and you need different decision pieces of information. But you're absolutely right. I think the reality is that we're finally trying to figure out some way to put some order to the chaos of information that people do deal with every day.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, one thing I could add to that is that if we think about the web right now, I mean, all of us go on the web, right, all the time, and you just follow links and you get to where you want to go. And what we've done with the CTDL, we've used that model. It's the model of the semantic web. So we can imagine a future where if the sources of the data used that model, it would just inherently link together, just like the web links web pages together. It's the same concept.
I know we could continue this for a while, but I'm also seeing that we are a couple of minutes past time, and I do want to respect everybody's calendars and commitments. Thank you, Jeanne, for that wonderful overview and that orientation to the work at hand. We will be following up to both the council members and to all the attendees today with the slides, the information about some of the definitions that we've shared here today. We'll also send out that beginning glossary as a starting point for additional terms that we may want to consider. And we'll ask you to help weigh in with additional thoughts that we should be working through. Our next meeting of the council is on June 23rd. And we'll continue this conversation about both the data elements around pathways and transfer, and also begin to transition into, if we have those data elements, what are the set of recommendations we want to begin to build for providers of credentials and competencies to call on them to actually publish the benchmark level of information that students and workers deserve to know in order to be able to make decisions about the equitable aspects of those pathways and transfer. Kristen, is there anything you want to close us out with?
No, I want to thank everybody for their time today, and we will be updating and finalizing the definition of equity, and that will continue to be the North Star for our work.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. We will send the recording of this and all the other materials out probably early next week after Memorial Day, and send out some additional follow-up after that in preparation for the June meeting. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and we'll see you soon.